Welcome to A-Push. Today we're going to be giving you just the bare bones details that you need to know about the War of 1812, one of our couple forgotten wars in American history because it's not as dramatic and exciting as the Revolutionary War, and it was fought for a lot of the same reasons. So here are the things that you need to take away from this. And let's give a brief overview of the conflict. So, the War of 1812 is just one theater in the Napoleonic Wars, which are wars that evolved out of the French Revolutionary Wars, starting in the 1790s and continuing all the way until 1815, when Napoleon is finally defeated. So, keep in mind, we're fighting England in the War of 1812, but England really doesn't care about the United States. England is very, very worried about Napoleon and his goals to create a unified Europe under the whole Bonaparte dynasty. So, we are not anywhere close to priority number one for Great Britain, although, Great Britain is priority number one for us some of the time. Honestly, it's much more about, it's about a couple different issues. The Impressment Controversy is a big controversy that had been going all the way back to the whole era of Washington, especially after the Battle of Trafalgar, which we see here with Horatio Nelson splitting and then crushing the French and Spanish fleet. The British would have dominance over the seas. So whereas we fought a quasi-war against France during Adams' administration, by the early 1800s, now it's mostly English ships that are harassing American sailors, and the fact that, of course, the Jeffersonians are anti-British means that tension with England is going to continue to ratchet up, especially when the British do blatantly provocative things like have a British ship take the USS Chesapeake right off the Virginia coast and take sailors right off of it. And so at this point, we can't do anything. If England wants to stop US warships the moment they leave our ports and then take our sailors and claim that they're British deserters, we really have no ability to stop them from doing that. Jefferson attempts to slow this process by passing something called the Embargo Act in 1807, which is an absolute ban on all trade with foreign countries, which on the one hand, yes, technically would solve the problem, but if it ever actually happened, which it was never adequately enforced, but if it even was, it'd be unbelievably detrimental to merchants and would just destroy especially the New England states, which are incredibly dependent on trade. So here you see the Embargo Act being passed. And here you see the value of both U.S. imports and exports. And so the U.S. economy grinds to a halt, at least the formal economy. And of course, we just simply go back to smuggling, which is, that the American pastime going all the way back to, 1650 when the British passed the Navigation Act or the Navigation Acts. So here we see a political cartoon making fun of Jefferson's embargo. The embargo in this cartoon is a snapping turtle. That they call the "Oh Grab Me," which is embargo spelled backwards. And you see him here trying to stop Americans from trading. And in reality, there's tons of trade going on in the background. So the embargo was both utterly ineffective and very unpopular, especially in areas of the country that depended on trade. When James Madison became president, because Jefferson had, of course, served his 2 terms and he did not run for a third following Washington's precedent, he ran partially on the platform of we're going to modify the Embargo Act and be a little bit more judicious about it. And so with that, his promise to kill the embargo, here's our poor turtle being decapitated. Madison is able to win a comfortable victory over Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. You see here, obviously not as smashing of a victory as Jefferson won in 1804, but clearly, hopefully you can understand why the New England states would not be voting Republican at this point. And so Madison is going to pass a couple different options. So one, the Non-Intercourse Act allows us to trade with everyone except for Britain and France, which doesn't really work. And then make its bill number 2, opens up trade with both if they respect neutral rights, which they didn't, but anyway, they were steps in that direction because the embargo was unpopular and unenforceable. All of this led to people pushing more strongly for war, specifically with England, because they were one, especially after Trafalgar, they were the ones who were most directly affecting American trade. And so we need to introduce a couple new politicians here to our story in order to talk about the War of 1812. The War Hawks were, of course, the ones who were in favor of war. So here is Henry Clay of Kentucky. He represents the West, and the West was for the most part in favor of war for reasons we'll talk about in a moment. This is John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. South Carolina was also in favor of war, and he represents the South. And the South was also in favor of war for reasons that we'll talk about momentarily. The main issues for the South and the West is in the West, they were worried about Native American attacks because Tecumseh was still alive and still mustering a coalition up in Canada. And so they were concerned that the British were not abandoning the forts within the Ohio River Valley and that they were going to empower the Native Americans to come down and drive the Americans out of the territory, which the British probably were not planning on doing, but it was a good story. And if this allowed us to attack Native Americans and secure more land, then all the better. In the South, they were mostly concerned about American honor and also somewhat concerned about impressment and the stopping of trade, because the South was utterly dependent on exports of tobacco for the majority of their income, at least for the wealthy planters. And so they felt like a war with England might open up some opportunities to trade more with France. In general, the New England colonies were against this because they felt like their port cities would be some of the first targets of the British. And so Daniel Webster of Massachusetts is going to represent the Dove faction, or the faction against the war. It should also be noted that most of the war hawks were Republicans and a lot of the Doves were Federalists, partially because of the trade issues and partially because the Federalists, again, wanted closer ties with England, whereas the Republicans wanted closer ties with France. So in 1812, this is more or less a referendum on the war. Madison is running against a fusion candidate, DeWitt Clinton of New York. He's going to join together Federalists and then disaffected anti-war Republicans in order to form a coalition that would lose handily to James Madison. So obviously the party system is starting to break down here, but support for the people who support the war greatly outnumber people who do not support the war, which means that we're going to war. So Madison drafts his war address, or his war address to Congress, and now we've got war with Great Britain and war with Native American tribes on the frontier. To overly simplify this war, there's more or less three basic theaters. There's the war in the north against the British and Native American allies. There's the war in the east once the British end the Napoleonic Wars and can actually send their army over. And then there's the war in the South, which is mostly Andrew Jackson attacking Native Americans and then occasionally defending the city of New Orleans. So let's take each of these in turn. The war in the North was again mostly against Tecumseh's somewhat rejuvenated Native American Federation and was a battle over the Great Lakes and trying to take cities up in Canada. We launched another invasion of Canada, of course, hoping to maybe get some territory out of it. And so one of the sort of unspoken causes of the war was some Americans were hoping that we could capture all of Canada and incorporate it into the United States. At the Battle of York, the modern day city of Toronto, you don't really need to know any of these details, but the end result is, I mean, you can pause and read them if you want, but the end result is we capture and burn the city, but we're unable to actually hold it because of a lack of supplies and the fact that the roads were terrible and we didn't have control or enough control over the Great Lakes to resupply our troops. So we capture and burn the city very early in the war, but later have to abandon it. So here's the burning of Toronto, or of York, which is going to come back to bite us later in the conflict. We then fight a naval battle on Lake Erie. This is the last major naval battle on the Great Lakes. The United States and Great Britain both have relatively small fleets on the Great Lakes. And so in the Battle of Lake Erie, an American fleet is able to defeat a British fleet, giving us dominance over the Great Lakes, which allow us to move our troops around much more easily, which is, of course, incredibly important. This battle leads to one of the more famous naval moments in U.S. history, where the Admiral Perry loses his flagship, and then jumps in a rowboat, rows across in the middle of the battle to move his flag to another ship, and then rallies his troops to victory. And so with the defeat of the British fleet, we now have the ability to move troops at will, which leads to the Battle of the Thames, which is a battle against some British and a lot of Native American forces. Because we, of course, have the ability to move troops around, we end up getting a favorable sort of position with the Native Americans sort of split around this swamp and trapped against the river. And so William Henry Harrison and his troops are able to win the Battle of the Thames, or Moravian Town, depending on which histories you're reading. And this battle is important because, of course, it's both a decisive victory for the United States, and because Tecumseh is killed in this battle, forever ending the threat of Tecumseh creating a massive Native American coalition. And so the very charismatic and skilled war leader of the Shawnee is dead. And this is the event that if Tippecanoe didn't break Native American power in the Ohio River Valley, the Battle of the Thames did for sure. Because it was without Tecumseh, the Native Americans are mostly or are unable to unite and effectively defend their holdings. After all of this somewhat success in the North, eventually the British get around to noticing that they're at war with us and launching a fleet across the Atlantic Ocean to teach us a lesson. This fleet is able to more or less take Washington, D.C. without facing much opposition. And so the British famously set fire to the president's house. James Madison is forced to flee, with his wife Dolly famously saving a picture of George Washington. And so the British burn down our capital, but are unable to launch their assault inward because they are stopped at Baltimore at the Battle of Fort McHenry. This is noteworthy because American poet Francis Scott Key was on board one of the British ships and saw by the rocket's red glare that our flag was still there, and the British were forced backwards. Near the end of the war, with the British offensive in full swing, and New England somewhat worried that they might be the next target for a massive British navy, Federalists in New England met at what's called the Hartford Convention, where they legitimately considered seceding from the United States and negotiating a separate treaty with England. And so the Hartford Convention is important because the war is about to take a decisive turn, and these Federalists, who were possibly considering basically betraying the United States, are going to look really, really foolish after we win, quote unquote, the War of 1812. So here you see New England Federalists maybe waiting to jump back into the King's loving embrace. In the South, the war is mostly a war against Native Americans. Sometimes it's not even considered a theater of the War of 1812. Sometimes it's simply called the Creek War. But anyway, Andrew Jackson, who is a slave trader and farmer in Tennessee, originally born in Virginia, he'll come back around in our story, and we'll introduce Andrew Jackson more thoroughly at some point. But he and a group of militia lead a successful campaign against the Creek tribe and are able to finally defeat a relatively large Creek army at Horseshoe Bend, breaking the power of the Creek Nation and forcing them to give up significant portions of their land. So this is an incredibly successful campaign for Andrew Jackson, but more successful for Andrew Jackson is his defense of New Orleans. Because after defeating the Creeks, Andrew Jackson gets word that a large British fleet has dropped an army in Louisiana and is preparing to attack New Orleans. So Jackson goes down with a group of militiamen and some Native American allies and sets up a defense. This is noteworthy because Jackson was massively outnumbered by the British force and won an incredibly one-sided victory, driving the British back and perhaps winning one of America's greatest military victories. So Jackson becomes the hero of New Orleans, despite the fact that at the time the battle was fought, the war had technically already ended with the Treaty of Ghent, which we'll deal with, I believe, next time. So here's Andrew Jackson famously standing on the redoubt, pointing and leading his troops to defeat this much larger British army, making Andrew Jackson a national hero and celebrity. So the war ends with the Treaty of Ghent, and again, it's basically status quo antebellum. It's negotiated very skillfully by John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, which is sort of catapults John Quincy Adams' political career. But the results are Native American power is broken, and the United States realizes a couple different things. They didn't really gain anything, at least against the British, out of the war, but they realized very quickly that all of this is stemming from our dependence on trade with Europe. And so this leads for a push for developing American infrastructure and developing American industry, because only if we are somewhat independent of Europe can we be confident that we're not going to get dragged into these foreign conflicts in the future. Oh, this also builds up American pride because one time an American ship, the USS Constitution, beat a British ship on the high seas. This was because of the strength of the British Navy. This was such a shocking event that this ship is still commissioned by the Navy and in Boston Harbor, and you can go see it if you want because it beat a British ship on the high seas once. That's super exciting. And this helped build up American pride. Look, it's James Madison punching the King of England in the face, just like Andrew Jackson punched the British in the face in New Orleans. And we punched those Native Americans in the face at the Battle of the Thames. And that one, remember the Constitution, that one ship that beat a British ship? Here it is in the background. Ah, how exciting. So, this allows us to feel like we defeated England, which, I guess? I don't know. I'll let you guys judge whether or not you think we defeated England in the War of 1812. So make sure you can provide substantive answers to each of these pieces, and when we come back next time, we'll look at the brave new world we're moving into after James Madison metaphorically punched the King of England in his face.